Hello, my name is Adrena Thomas. I'm currently a A+ consultant, and today I will be training you on a strategy called ESPN. What is ESPN? ESPN is a strategy that involves characterization. Characterization is the process in which ideas and objects are recognized, differentiated, and understood. This type of characterization that students usually and most often excel in is at comparing and contrasting. This strategy is utilized to help students take acquired content, materials, resources, and apply it in a manner that will strengthen their ability in what? In using specific categories to process new information, recognizing recurring trends and patterns, and helping to understand and explain the complex events in development, analyzing your primary and secondary resources, comparing multiple resources, citing textual evidence because you're pulling evidence from a text, gaining an understanding of different factors influencing events and decisions, and finally, making predictions and drawing conclusions. This is the how to ESPN. How do I prepare? I understand what it is. I understand how it helps. How as an educator? This is how you prepare or preparation for ESPN. The teacher should first become familiar with each category that goes to ensuring the understanding of the students. What categories are you talking about? These categories are on the what to go into category chart, and it is categorized into 4 categories. And with these examples of social study information and subcategories that will fall up under the 4 major categories. Pause. ESPN preparation. How do I prepare to teach ESPN? First and foremost, the teacher must become familiar not only just with the categories of ESPN, but also the subcategories. It's a chart that I'll go over next that gives you the different categories and subcategories. And it also a chart that I will go over that shows you the what goes into category chart that you will give to your students. Secondly, you must annotate ahead of time what particular items from the selected reading that you've chosen the students are expected to identify to complete the ESPN template. So how do you prepare? You become familiar with the categories and subcategories. You become familiar with just the ESPN chart or template as a whole. And you read ahead of time and pull out different examples that you think the students will be familiar with or understand or pull out during their reading. This is simply an example of the ESPN template, what each area stands for. And this is what you'll pass out to your students for them to write their information. The E is economic, S is social, P is political, N is environment. Now remember when I was talking about the categories and the subcategories, this is the chart that I was discussing. You must become familiar with this because when you're giving your students the template, they're going to ask you, what does economic mean? What are you talking about with political? So on this chart, you can use this to kind of give them some examples to connect with what reading resource you're going to give them. So for economics, an example could be look at the money system, look at the trade, look at different products. For social, you can ask them to look for the foods that they were eating, their family life, the gender roles, the clothing, the education. When you're looking at political, ask them to look for, are there any elections, votings, government structure, the rights that were given to the citizens. And then finally, environment. What were some natural disasters? What were some man-made disasters? What was the demographic? What human interaction was with plants and animals? And these will kind of help guide your students when they're reading to be able to easily pull out information. So we understand what ESPN is. We understand how you can prepare. We've looked at the 2 different templates, the charts. Now you're ready to teach a strategy, the ESPN strategy. So the first thing you must do in your class is introduce the strategy to the students. Help them understand what they're about to learn, how they're going to learn it. And this would kind of help also introducing prior knowledge, how to classify information, introduce what you're about to read, see if they have any prior knowledge from their past grade levels. Then you're going to instruct them as to how events and their causes and effects are often classified into 4 categories. And our 4 categories are economic, social, political, and environment. Then you will distribute the what goes into category chart. And you'll provide them with some examples. So don't just give them the chart, but as a class, talk about some examples to see if they understand what the 4 categories are and how to pull out that information. Then you will distribute your primary and your secondary materials. This is what they're going to read. This is what they'll use to pull out examples of economic, social, political, and environment. Then you'll break your students up into, it is suggested, 3 to 4 groups, but you know your class, you know how your students can be broken up. And they'll be in those groups, and throughout the classroom, place different stations, and even it could be in the groups, in the different groups, and allow the students to rotate to different stations to read those primary and secondary resources. And during that time, they'll start pulling out information. The students will read and analyze and write down as many examples of ESPN that they can find. You must make sure that they have time to rotate to every group to examine the resources, because this is going to allow you and lead you to your final thing, and that is a discussion. Ask them, why did they choose this example? Justify your example. Then they're able to kind of talk with you and talk with their classmates and see how things connect and how they're related. So at this time, if you notice that some students are struggling doing this ESPN, here are some strategies and tips that you can use for our struggling students. First, just focus on 1 to 2 categories. Do not try to give them all 4 categories. Provide them with exemplars for students to use as guides. Provide them with the same resource to examine and then debrief, then move on. What am I saying? Give them a resource. Work with them with that resource. Make sure they understand that resource. Make sure they pull out the information. Talk about it. Then you allow them to move to the next one. But you kind of guide them through that. Divide the students into categories and just assign a group a particular category. This group will only be responsible for going to different stations and pulling out economic section or social examples. Just give them that particular category. Now, you may have some advanced students that you already know in your classroom. Here are some tips for your advanced students. Increase the complexity of the document. Allow them to read a resource that's on a higher grade level. Have the students identify resources that can be classified not just in one area, but several categories. And require the students to develop an annotated timeline. So not only are they pulling out resources, but they're putting things in order. And then expand the annotated timeline to a longer period of time. So give them a longer period of time. So in my conclusion, we've talked about ESPN. It is about characterization. We've talked about how it works, how it can help you in your classroom. We've talked about how you can prepare, making sure you understand the categories, the subcategories, making sure you have read the information and you've pulled out information and examples. We've talked about the different charts, the charts you would give your students, and the charts you can use as a resource. And we've talked about the process. You introduce it, You give them information, you talk about it, you make sure that they understand the different headings, you provide them with those primary and secondary resources, you put them in different stations, making sure they have time to rotate to each station. You lead a discussion to help them explain why they chose those examples. That concludes my training for ESPN. Thank you.